that would be used to make these wafers. Those paddles of the iron, the round forms, were ornamented, I hope you can see that, with floral, figurative, or geometric designs, and sometimes they had particular inscriptions, names, and dates, or heraldry. The irons I'm showing you here actually have names on them, Renzo and Lucia Pacca, and the date 1481, presumably the year they were married, as well as a romantic inscription. This representation of a wedding banquet by the painter Sandro Botticelli is especially fantastic, but still indicative of the great pomp and expense that could be associated with these marriage banquets. Botticelli's painted banquet took place in an open loggia around a credenza piled high with costly gold and silver plate there in the foreground, with food carried to tables by servants wearing livery to feed the equally ostentatiously dressed guests. The bride is probably this woman here in center left wearing white, and a servant here bowing in front of her and leaving a plate of food. Like the procession through town with the dowry goods, an elaborate celebration like this would have solidified the bonds between the families in a very visible manner. Public display guaranteed the future of the union. But celebrations were, of course, ephemeral. So the palace where the couple lived, when this public part of the ritual was over, and where they kept all of the objects we've been discussing, served as a much more permanent status symbol. The money spent on these palaces enhanced the reputation of the family in a constant public manner. Marco Parenti was luckier than most men because he was an only son, and he was due to inherit his father's palace. So he brought Katerina there to live. He didn't have to buy his own or build his own home. But he still had to furnish their living spaces and recorded the purchase of many large beds and chests, as well as various devotional objects and other items to do so in his memoranda. The bedchamber was the center of activity and the site of gatherings of family, friends, and business associates during the Renaissance. It was therefore the ideal place to keep the family's most precious possessions. The most expensive piece of furniture for the new home, and the most important item in any bedchamber, from both a literal and a dynastic standpoint, was of course the couple's bed. We have very few that survive, and very few that survive completely intact at all. But we do know that some Renaissance beds, like the one at the left, would have had large platforms with high headboards and surrounding chests, and it could therefore hold multiple sleepers, while day beds, like the one on the right, were long, narrow benches with high wooden backs and sides, wide enough only for a single person. But both of these kinds of beds would have been outfitted with precious textiles and ornamented with intarsia, paint, or even attached paintings, which could be as provocative as Botticelli's Venus and Mars, where the lounging figures, rather like the reclining nudes on the inner lids of the chests I showed you earlier, were meant to encourage a couple to think about fertility and procreation. Many men purchased a sacred, or at least a quasi-sacred object to sanctify and protect their homes, to serve as a focus for devotion, and to mediate between their families and the outside world. These objects might represent an iconic image like the crucifixion, or the Madonna and Child, or other holy figures, like the sculpture and painting seen here, also from the exhibition, originally placed in domestic interiors. Some men received devotional paintings and sculptures as an inheritance, gift, or loan from their fathers, or as part of their wives' dowries, while others purchased them directly. Marco Parenti bought a Madonna Relief as part of the cost for his marriage, perhaps in fact like the one on the left. And if you go up into the galleries, the great thing about the one on the left is you can get up close and take a good look at it. And I'm sorry for the cell phone camera image, which is not terrific. But if you look where I've made her look like she has on red earrings, I'm afraid, if you look in there, can you just see these two little holes? There's little holes punched on some of these around their neck and sometimes around their wrists because people, as a practice, might put little floral garlands around them or actual jewelry to help adorn them and give them honor. And you could do that in the home, you could do that in churches too, but it's great when you see examples where they actually did this in a home. Many artists, or at least many artist workshops, made devotional objects like these on commission or in multiples, meeting the acquisitive nature of this merchant society as easily and as inexpensively as possible. As I noted earlier, the intimate representation of mother and child in these objects also served as encouragement, of course, for pregnancy and childbirth. Children were the real reason behind marriage and behind many of these objects, and by children they really meant boys. since this was a patriarchal society and boys continued the family, while girls were married off and continued somebody else's family. To encourage procreation, beginning in the 1370s, new wives received wooden childbirth trays to encourage, celebrate, and commemorate childbirth. The front of these trays might be painted with appropriate mythological, literary, or biblical subject matter, or even, as you can see here, with a representation of a new mother in her bedchamber following the birth itself. The back of the tray might have a coat of arms, a checkerboard, or even, as you see here on the right, a talismanic image of a naked boy playing with a sort of windmill and, as the inscription tells us, urinating a gold and silver stream out toward the viewer. Such an image was a prompt to help a woman create her own son. Both ancient and Renaissance theories of sympathetic magic insisted that looking at something could create it in the womb. A woman was therefore warned to avoid looking at things like toads or hairy beasts before or during her pregnancy, in case the power of sympathetic magic resulted in birth defects or even what would have been termed a monstrous birth. Instead, she should only look at representations of little boys to ensure she created one herself. And both birth trays and bowls, as well as marriage chests, were deliberately painted with these representations. At times, these naked boys were especially active. This example, I sort of love this one the best. This example shows two boys engaged in a battle, one pulling at the penis of the other in what must have been an illustration of a popular saying now lost to us today. Keep this on a little bit, By the early 16th century, painted wooden bowls instead of flat trays with related images painted in their concavities and undersides were also used, like this example representing the naming of St. John the Baptist. At the same time, tin-glazed earthenware, or maiolica, was also popular, whether Tuscan examples painted with sort of stylized representations of swaddled infants, like the one at the top, you're looking into the bowl, or historiated maiolica, or story-painted maiolica from central Italy with bedchamber, or even, in this case, a childbirth scene with the mother on her birthing stool surrounded by women who are caring for her, the midwife reaching between her legs to pull out the newborn child. And that's the side view of that bowl there on the right. So it's kind of, you'd look at the outside and you see this beautiful ornamented design, but when you look on the inside, which maybe only the mother could do while she's finished eating or whatever was kept in the bowl, you would see this more talismanic, appropriate image. All of these trays and bowls were used to serve or carry food and drink to the new mother after childbirth, when she also received things like embroidered nightshirts, lace bed caps, and special linens, and when she entertained the many well-wishers in her bedchamber with wine and candies, and they remained in her home as a treasured possession for years after. After these children were born, they needed assistance to get through the potential trauma of their early years. The first and most basic form of protection was provided by the sacrament of baptism, a ritual with sacred, familial, and even civic components, since the city of Florence was under the protection of St. John the Baptist. Baptismal sponsors, or godparents, gave mother and child lengths of cloth, metalware goblets, food, coins, and forks or spoons in special holders as gifts. Following baptism, the newborn was often sent to a wet nurse in the countryside for several years, and that occasion triggered the accumulation of additional objects to keep the child safe, warm, and comfortable, like swaddling, linens, caps, amulets, cribs, and even rattles, like this one, with fantastic beasts and glittering bells and whistles. This one is a later example, but it's very unusual to find early examples because many got melted down in the interim years. Florentines acquired these objects, all of these objects, in great quantities. But the Christian church saw such extravagance, like the banquet represented in this detail from a marriage chest panel in the exhibition, as harmful to the soul. A friar from the 1420s asked in a sermon, "How can one describe the luxuries which one may often find not only in the palaces of the great, but in the houses of common citizens? Consider the size and softness of the beds. There you will find silken and linen sheets, with borders of fine gold embroidery, precious coverlets, painted and provocative of lust, and gilded and painted curtains. Other religious figures also warned against this kind of luxury, encompassing the sort of good food, sumptuous clothing, carpets, tapestries, and metalware and ceramics, like those seen here that are upstairs in the exhibition. But none of these warnings were very effective, because Florentines were not penalized for the accumulation of objects where it might have affected them the most. They were not asked to report the value of their household furnishings on their tax declarations, so they did not pay taxes on them and could take advantage of domestic display as an outlet for their supplemental income. Florentines treasured their objects and the messages these objects sent to their fellow citizens. So the government, made up of men with some of the highest incomes and the most splendid palaces, did not ask its citizens to relinquish them, no matter how many priests preached against them. The palaces of prosperous Florentine families, their red-tiled rooftops scattered throughout this frescoed city view, provided an ideal setting for families and the objects associated with them. Within one of these palaces, surrounded by the kind of objects we've been looking at, Marco Parenti and Katerina Strozzi enjoyed the charmed life of the Florentine elite. They raised their children, married them off, and prospered financially. But this ended in 1481, after 34 years of marriage, when Marco recorded Katerina's death in his memoranda book. A Florentine wife was usually younger than her husband. Katerina was 9 years, Marco's junior. And if she survived her childbearing years, as Katerina did, she often ended her days as a widow. According to tax records, a quarter of all adult women in Florence were widows in the 15th century. So Katerina's death was probably unexpected. Marco would have thought he would die first. Marco recorded her death alongside his entry on their marriage in his memoranda book. On the first page, to a merchant accustomed to double-entry bookkeeping, which was really an innovation of the Florentine Renaissance, this made sense because her death closed her account. Marco provided his female relations with lengths of brown wool to make their mourning garments for a period of time following her death, and he gave Katerina an honorable burial in his family tomb. Death might give the objects associated with a wife a sentimental quality. This painting of a young man gazing at a brooch could be a husband remembering his deceased wife by her favorite jewelry. The brooch, which is in the shape of a pelican pecking her breast, during this period symbolized Christ's passion and sacrificial love, and therefore maternal love too. It was a popular motif, and there are surviving brooches like the one at the right that have a similar subject matter, probably an ideal gift for a young bride or a mother. Like the man in this painting, Marco apparently did mourn Katerina, though like many widowers from this era, he was perhaps more practical than sentimental. He made back some of the costs of her counter-dowry, those beautiful clothes and that peacock garland I talked about earlier, by selling what remained of it through the second-hand dealers in the town. Objects associated with family rituals, like Katerina's celebratory clothing, as well as some of the furniture, paintings, sculpture, and other objects I've shown you today, were always in demand. So if they were not passed on to heirs, they were often sold on the second-hand market. Few things were so inconsequential that they lacked resale potential, though they sometimes had to be transformed to make them appropriate for a new setting or a new family. The front of this childbirth tray on the left was painted with a Petrarchan triumph of love for a Florentine marriage around the year 1460, but its back on the right was repainted with a new heraldic device in 1537, indicating it was either handed down or sold to celebrate the new marriage represented by that device after the original couple no longer needed it. Marco Parenti never remarried, although his wealth and his social status would have made him a very good catch. He outlived Katerina by 16 years, and after a long and prosperous life, he died in 1497. Domestic objects, like those he bought for his family palace and those I've shown you today, united Florentine citizens. The contents of their palaces, like those shown in this woodcut, provided a comforting and recognizable setting for the great emphasis on family life that flourished during this era. While most objects were utilitarian, a great many were also aesthetically pleasing and oftentimes didactic. And it is this diverse group, the intarsiated beds, the marriage chests and birth trays, the terracotta Madonnas, the historiated ceramics, and things like that, that reveal so much about Florentine life and love. These objects, accumulated and preserved with such care by 19th century collectors like Friedrich Stibbert, give us a truly vivid understanding of Renaissance family life. Thank you. I'm certainly happy to take any questions if there are any. Go ahead.
When they made the wafer, what was the romantic inscription of that?
Oh, the one I showed you, I can't remember. It's something about love being evergreen on that one, but there's all kinds of things, some quotes from poems and things like that.
I wasn't sure why I was curious about that, but it struck me.
Go ahead.
Just the thought about why the other end was in the fire, plus you had to get the wafer
Had to
out.
get the wafer out. So you would think she'd go put it on the floor. How's she going to use it again if the end gets hot on the handle, right?
She's gonna pick it out, and at the moment of the picture, she takes it and pulls it right back.
Yeah, I don't know. That was kind of dangerous to me, but I'm not flux, so.
This is more of a cultural question than probably an artistic one, but I'm wondering, how long was an engagement? How long did they have time to make these chests, to collect these in a chest?
Well, some are made for the open market. So, sorry, should I be on the microphone?
I can hear you.
Some are made for the open market. So if they were, you could kind of go in and maybe get like the corners. You'd put your coat of arms on the corners. If you're upstairs, you can see there are like little shields in some places for coats of arms. So you could have little bits of them personalized. And then if they're ready-made, you can get them. Other times, though, depending on the age of the woman in particular, you might get engaged when you're quite young, and it would be several years before you were actually married. So there was plenty of time in those cases to make all of the different things or to acquire all of the different things that you needed. Go ahead.
I actually have two questions. The first one pertains to when you showed the three portraits of the women side by side. To have the woman on the far left facing the audience, wasn't that highly unusual, particularly for the late 15th century?
Good, absolutely. You don't really get a lot of, where am I here? Somewhere? I have more slides than I thought I had.
It was very early on.
Yeah.
I mean, the other two are far, far more typical in that you can see a woman from
Yeah. 1480 is around the time that you're getting people like Leonardo da Vinci who do start to turn women's heads in particular, sort of 3/4 of the way or full view in things like the Mona Lisa, right? But that's beginning around 1470s, 1480s, around Leonardo's circle. But as you can see, the Giovanna degli Uffizi is 1488, and that's 1490, and they're still profile. So it was a slow change, and many people argue that it's not appropriate to show a woman looking full face, right? Because a woman with all of these different restraints on her behavior shouldn't be looking out at you. She should be looking like this. It's also, of course, a little bit easier to paint it in profile,
And
right?
particularly to have her actually gazing at the viewer
Yeah.
is highly, highly unusual.
But if you do put her in profile like this, you get to show the fabulous sleeves, right, with all of the great embroidery. You get to add sort of, the jewelry that sort of bumps out, and you see it in profile, and it's much more dramatic that way. So there were advantages to keeping it in profile too. And it's just kind of a squishy period where you're getting some that are full face or 3/4 view, and some that are still in profile in the late 15th century.
My second question pertained to the cataloging of private collections. Well, I mean, I thought I was loud enough, but now I can be super loud.
Now you're really loud.
My second question pertained to the cataloging of private collections. When would you say, first off, that became semi-commonplace, and secondarily, when did they begin to introduce artists' names into the collection in terms of placing an importance upon the creator of the piece, particularly with paintings?
When you're talking about collections, you mean 15th century, like inventories that I was talking
Yes.
about? Very rarely do you get an artist's name. I used to sort of jump up and down in excitement when I came across a document that actually even gave a subject matter, never mind an artist's name. It's relatively rare. We're talking about like the Medici family of Florence, who were the most important family in 15th century Florence. Their inventory was done for a different kind of purpose, and there are artist names in that, but for sort of the average guy in Florence,
be a naive question, but how different were the cultural aspects that you talked about and the artistic aspects in Venice versus Florence at this time?
There were actually quite a lot of similarities in terms of how women were seen, how women behavior should be, but there were different kinds of rituals that would surround things like marriage and childbirth and things like that. Venice often got quite ostentatious, even more so than Florence did, and then that's where they would try to crack down with things like sumptuary legislation, which would allegedly control, but Florence did this too, but Venice in particular, which would allegedly control what you could do, what you could wear, how many people you could feed, what you could feed them. But then often all you had to do was pay a sort of fee to get exempt from those regulations. So they're very handy to read the regulations because it gives you an idea of what people really were trying to do, right? If they're violating it, then that's why there's laws.
First, thank you. That was great. I have a question about the wall text in the exhibition. It mentions that the cassoni were often commissioned or purchased in pairs. What can you talk a little bit more about that?
They were. When you look in inventories, you'll often see that it's described as un paio, a pair of chests. And often you can, there's none in the exhibition, right? Where there's an actual pair, yeah. But you can sometimes put them together even today. Survival rates are not great, but you can come up with, half a story will be on one chest, half on the other. If you remember this, for example. Sorry, I should know where everything is, and I have no clue. There we go. This pair has two different kinds of Roman narratives, ancient Roman stories, and we really put them together largely because, of course, they've got the naked couple on the inside, and they're painted quite similarly, so that kind of anchors that connection to us, but they were often done in pairs. Some people argue that it's because it should be kind of representational, one should be the male, one should be the female, but they held everything. It's not like only the guy could put his clothes in that one and the woman in that one. There's no closets in Renaissance houses, so chests are really important. And I think they would put in it whatever they could put in it, but they often did come in pairs.
Hi. Was it common for there to be more than one pair of marriage chests in a house for one newlywed couple?
Yes, actually, you could have quite a few pairs because they would often be handed down. They were quite valuable objects, and so they might be handed down. So you might have your father's in the house as well, or your mother's, or you might get more than one set. It's very difficult to tell because the inventories are very cursory for the most part, so you don't know where they came from. They might just describe it as a marriage chest, but you don't know necessarily if it's the marriage of the couple that you think lived in that house, or if it's the fathers or the mothers or what have you, but you could have several.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. It was awesome. And I'm wondering how the finance worked within the marriage at the time.
How the, sorry?
Finance.
Finances?
Yes.
The women had no control at all. The dowry, the monetary part of the dowry, the monetary part of the dowry would be given over to the new husband, and he would have control of it, ostensibly to take care of her, to buy her clothes, to take care of the house, to take care of the kids. And if she died, he often had to give that back to her family, to her natal family. But pretty much we're talking about the men being in charge of what's going on here. Later on in the 16th century and beyond, sometimes you could get women that would have a certain amount of control over finances, but it's relatively rare in 15th century Florence. The part of the dowry that her father would give her would be goods, and part of it would usually be money or land, something like that.
Hey, thank you. It's been fascinating listening to you. With all the emphasis on family and creating a family, I was surprised when you said that they sent their child away to a wet nurse. Was it not appropriate to take care of your own child and nurse a child?
On the social level that I'm mostly talking about here, which is kind of middle to upper class Florentines, you often sent the child away, in part because they understood enough about pregnancy that they believed that if you sent the child away, then the woman could get pregnant right away again if she wasn't nursing. And that was the ideal. And it just was kind of I think to me at least, reading the different documents, it's really kind of a status thing too. You would send your child away, but then of course the wet nurse would have to send her child away, and it would kind of go down the food chain, right? So that you would send your child away to someone a little bit lower social class, and then a little bit lower, and it would keep going. It was also the idea of being out in the countryside, which was thought to be healthier than in an urban setting. So it was also allegedly a good thing for the child, though the death rates for children that were sent to wet nurses are absolutely appalling for this period.
Any other questions?
So I'm interested in knowing the role of clergy. It appeared in the one scene that there was at least a contractual agreement happening, but by this time, wasn't it necessary for them to have a religious ceremony as well? Or
Not
when was that?
necessarily. When I first started to do my research, this kind of surprised me as well. I mean, not until the Council of Trent in the later 16th century do you really need to recognize marriage as a sacrament in that way, in the way we might think of it today. In the middle part of the 15th century, the time when Katerina and Marco get married, it was the hand clasp, which signifies the public agreement and the willingness to marry. You had to be willing, and you show that through the hand clasp, which goes back to classical antiquity, and that was enough. You could have some kind of a blessing or something like that at a church door sometimes, but not, you wouldn't have sort of what we might think of as a full-blown church wedding. That's just not what was done.
Anyone else? Oh, one more.
Hi. You had mentioned that the death rates for the children were appalling. Is that because of an infection?
Sometimes infection, sometimes malnourishment, sometimes there's a lot of really heartbreaking diary entries about people who send their child off to the wet nurse, and the wet nurse rolls over the child while the child's sleeping alongside of her. They actually created little, I forgot the Italian term for it, like little cages that they would put over the child in the bed, so that if you rolled over near the child, you wouldn't smother it. You would be stopped by this kind of ribbed cage that you would put over the child. So it could be malnourishment, it could be overlaying, it could be all kinds of diseases and neglect. This was not the most hygienic period, and there was a lot going on, and these children were very vulnerable to it.
What was healthcare like in that time?